Elisa Chen Sukhobok is the founder of Potomac Debate Academy, a travel debate team that regularly competes and places in national tournaments like NSDA Nationals and other invitationals. She also mentors students in college admissions, helping them to gain admission to top universities. She holds a JD from the University of Virginia, a Master's of Education from UPenn, and I recently interviewed one of her students, Karina Guo, who, along with her teammate, won the NSDA national competition in public forum. Elisa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So as I said in my email, your resume is very likely the most impressive that I have seen in the world of debate till this point. Could you briefly run us through the highlights and how you came to be a debate coach?
Yeah, so first, I'm very flattered to be on this podcast. In terms of my journey, it's been a really windy one, so full of detours. I think my debate journey really started in high school when I joined the high school debate team. Also, like the weirdest detour, I actually wanted to join volleyball, but I had a pretty severe case of Lyme disease. Like it was really bad, like to the extent that like I was hospitalized. So clearly, physical activity was out of the question.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was really bad. And then my friend was like, well, let's do something not physical, right? Let's join the debate team. So that's kind of how it started. And it was one of those things that like I wasn't looking for, wasn't expecting, and then kind of fell in love with activity right away. And in fact, actually, a lot of our kids are also athletes. I think it's that competitiveness in athletes and in debaters that kind of overlap. And just since I joined, I just kind of like loved activity. And funny enough, I was like, well, this is like my favorite activity. This is my passion in high school. It makes sense to go to law school, right? Like you would think like that's kind of the career path that's most, I guess, a direct pathway to debate. And so like prior to joining the debate team, like I was like a STEM kid, like thinking about going into some STEM field. And as a result of debate, I ended up being a poli-sci major in college, was part of my college's debate team. And I thought for sure, like law makes the most amount of sense. And of course I went to law school. And I think once I got to law school, I don't want to like knock anyone's legal pursuits or aspirations. It's a great field. But I think ultimately it wasn't the perfect fit for me. I was really young when I went to law school. So I graduated college early, never really worked a full-time job, went straight into law. Was very naive in what I thought law was. Like I had this picture of like law and order, like it was very different, right? So I probably should have done a little bit more research and kind of reflection before I took that big plunge. But quite honestly, I think in reflection, I'm still kind of happy that everything happened the way it did, because I think I was so miserable in law that I figured like this isn't what I'm looking for, you know? And I think having spent a few years in law and kind of exploring different avenues in the legal pathway, I just realized that like it wasn't the career, it was the field. Like it was just the entire field that I wasn't having the same passion. And there were moments where I was like, I remember like even now, years later, it was very distinct. Like I had an interview at a law firm and, they do the standard questions. And one of the curveball questions was, if you weren't pursuing law, if you weren't going to be a lawyer, what would your career be? And I was like, oh, this is the easiest question. I would start debate school and be a debate coach. And I think it was one of those moments where I'm like, why am I not doing that? Like, why am I sitting in this law or legal, a law firm interview? And so there were just moments like that where finally I think I was so unhappy in where my legal career was, and just not like, like not to be cliche, but like not waking up and loving my job and not wanting to, stick with it. So I took the plunge and just kind of said, I feel like I would always regret if I don't give this an honest try, like really, build a team from the way I envision it. And so then kind of went from debate to law to back to debate, ironically. And I'm really happy I took the plunge, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
It does take a lot of bravery and probably just sort of self-awareness to be able to stop, especially a very serious career, at the beginning or midway, and do something else, right? Even if it is kind of a dream, it can be really scary. Do you think that's common in law for people to work it for reasons to be in the field for reasons other than the fact that they love the job?
I think it's so different because peers and friends I went to law school with, they're definitely a group of people who like love the law. Like this is their thing. Like, they're so happy where they're at. I'm extremely happy and proud of them. And I think there are people like, I mean, let's be real, it's a really lucrative field, right? Like, I mean,
True.
also
Very
law
true.
school is expensive. There are a lot of
A very
student loans.
prestigious one as well. Yeah.
Right, right. So like I'm sure just like in any field, I'm sure there are people who are not in it just to love the field. And I think for me personally, I thought I loved the field. I just again probably didn't do enough research into thinking about like what that really meant. Because ironically, I love like all the overlaps I've had with debate, but you know, there's
Yeah.
a lot, there's a lot more that goes into the legal field. And like, for example, I hated the bureaucracy of it. I hated certain aspects that I think are very much tied, and you know, you can't really separate that from the legal field. But yeah, I think actually, for example, a lot of our coaches on the team end up going to law school. And
Mm.
I'm always the one to be like, look, I don't want to knock on your dreams. It could be a perfect fit, but I wish somebody told me these things before I pursued law school.
Right. And I guess there's a lot of common misconceptions, especially like as far as law is displayed sort of in media, the same as like the field of medicine. And so, okay, doing debate is not the same as practicing law, but what is the connection between the two? Because I think for most debaters, they would think, okay, I have some kind of competency and, you know, doing research and obviously putting together cases and arguing cases, right? And fielding, you know, cross-ex and things like that. Are some of those skills actually directly applicable to law, or is it kind of not really?
No, absolutely. I think there's a lot of application, like research for sure, right? Like anytime you work on, you know, case law, writing a brief, like there has to be a lot of research that goes into it. And I think debaters kind of naturally transition to those positions. A lot of reading, a lot of writing, critical thinking. But I think with any job, there's also a lot of like other things that are probably not as glorified in the media, right? Like in terms of just grunt work, in terms of like the number of hours you're expected, like what's norm in your field, and just administrative tasks, like all the boring stuff. And sometimes like,
Yeah.
especially early on in your career, that's like the majority of the stuff. But yeah, I do think there is a lot of natural overlap between debate and the legal field.
More than watching Law and Order, yes?
Yes, yes, yeah. But
All
the
right,
media
cool.
just
That should
paints up
be
all the, I was just gonna say the media just paints all the fun stuff, right?
right. There's not TV shows about the 15 hours of prep work every day that you need to do before you get to the courtroom. All right, tell me about Potomac. Potomac is a travel debate team, yes?
Correct. Yes. Well, right now we're not doing a whole lot of travel because of COVID.
Hmm.
But yes, pre-COVID and hopefully one day post-COVID,
Hmm.
there's quite a bit of travel involved.
What does that mean? What is a travel debate team?
Yeah. So the way that we started Potomac Debate, it was really organic and from our local community. So we're located in Montgomery County, which is actually where I grew up as well. So
Hmm.
I am a Woodton alum. I have friends who, you know, go to all the school, or went to all the schools that our kids are from now, like Richard Montgomery, Churchill, so forth. And I'm a product of MCPS debate, right? Like when I competed as a high school student, I competed in our local county circuit. Um, it's not the most competitive circuit. And again, I'm not trying to knock the public schools, but obviously funding resources are limited by the public schools.
Right.
So like aside from a few kind of unique situations, for the most part, the county students don't go to national circuit. They don't travel. They just kind of compete in the county. Um, and so what I really loved doing when I was a college debater is like traveling to all these tournaments and meeting new people. And I think part of that travel is also exposure to like these diverse opinions and perspectives that you probably wouldn't hear in like just a smaller, more localized circuit. And so our original goal was just to kind of like open up Montgomery County, which is where we're from, into something that's kind of competitive and has a pipeline into the national circuit. So that's how we originally built the team, and that's what we meant by travel. So it would be not necessarily an alternative, but like an additional experience for kids in the county who typically wouldn't be able to go to national circuit tournaments. Since then, we've expanded, you know, much more beyond Montgomery County. So I think, but it's with a similar mission in mind that like for students who traditionally don't really compete or access the national circuit.
Looking at Potomac's website, you have a ton of coaches working for you as well.
Correct.
Yes, I think student coaches and also perhaps grad school or college level, you know, debate coaches. How did this evolve? How did Potomac evolve to be this kind of monster program?
Yeah, so I think our very first class was like maybe 6 students. Like it started off like really, really tiny. And one of the students that you recently interviewed, Karina, I think she was not in our inaugural class, but maybe our second class. So it started off like really, really organic. And that's one of the things that I'm really proud of, that like we grew because of the reputation of our program, because of the quality of our program. We never started with like a built-in pipeline or anything like that. But I think just from word of mouth and like, I think this is activity that kids see as fun and then parents see as educational. Like you get these kids to read and write without, forcing them or like making them like super upset with, the activity, right? So that natural competitiveness built in helps. And I think, there's, in one way, I think kind of COVID made us innovate. So like prior to COVID, we've had people kind of bring up the idea of like, well, what about going online, And my gut feeling at first was like, well, no, it's like an inherently in-person activity, right? Like you need to communicate with your partner, and like there's things that judges can only see in person, like it's just not as dynamic online. Of course, that completely changed when COVID hit, and we didn't really have a choice. But I actually think that like having pivoted online, or forced to pivot online rather, I think debate's actually much more easy to transition online than we had initially thought. Yeah, there's some things that you lose out by not being in person, but for the most part, like nonverbal communication, research, all of that, like these things are still kind of there in the online community. So I think once we expanded online and we're able to kind of grow our client base, obviously, then we also needed more coaches. But I think the other positive is that being online has made debate so much more accessible to students. I mean, we're seeing students who are from like smaller communities or sometimes rural communities. Like there's just no way we would have been able to physically reach them if we, were to be in person the whole time.
Yeah, that seems to be a consensus of a lot of people, that there's obviously a trade-off, right, with online debate, but very few people after going, especially to a couple of tournaments, are totally disappointed with it. There's very few people who, don't lose some of the ideas they had about going in beforehand. And I would say that's the same for me, both going to tournaments, let's say to judge or take students there, and also with coaching. Like my first class that I coached on Zoom, I had, I think, 2 hours notice because my school, there was like a government law handed down same day. Our school had to be closed, and I was really nervous about it. I mean, you have to prepare for classes, and I had no prep time, and it was so nice. It was just fine. It was the first time I'd ever used Zoom. I downloaded Zoom, made a link, sent it to the students, and that's it. And it was fine,
Yeah.
I still love meeting with people in person. I think we all do. Of course, there is something you lose, right, with the digital divide, but it's pretty good. I think a lot better than you think before you start it.
Yeah, for sure.
So I, like many people, have a personal maybe list of pet peeves with debate. Almost everyone has them. Yeah. So my question, I guess, is what are yours, as far as like how it's just practiced, right, in the States or maybe in your circuit, and maybe more broadly, is there any way that you feel that debate, is practiced in the U.S. that lets kids down in the development of their, let's say, their intellect or their character or their skills?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things I feel like I really appreciate about the national circuit, but I think some of those same things, it just really depends on the student and their skill level and kind of their exposure. But some of those same things kind of make the entry like a lot higher, like the barrier to entry a lot, more steep, the learning curve a lot more steep. So one of the things is like I mean, I was previously an LD debater in high school, and so like I'm used to speed. I also think I naturally talk fast. But one of the things are things like progressive debate and speed in particular. So the way that we actually do it on our team is that new students who join our team, complete novice students who don't have any previous exposure to public speaking and debate, we definitely don't teach them like circus style at first, because I feel like that's just super overwhelming for someone who's new to the activity. But eventually, as they get more competitive, they get more into the activity, they want to kind of pivot to the national circuit. And I think that kind of first pivot, the first tournament, the first exposure, it's a really difficult, like learning curve on debating about topics in class and like, kind of thinking about just like logical arguments and not really necessarily the most strategic arguments. Like, I think that's another pet peeve, right? Not just to speak, but like sometimes arguments that we know are not true, but just work in a debate space. That's really hard to explain to a kid. They're like, well, this makes no sense and it's not realistic, but it wins and it works, right?
Yeah.
Or like just like really squirrely arguments where like you're like, well, this logically doesn't make sense, but their evidence says that it makes sense. Things like that, where I feel like, yes, I mean, at the end of the day, some people view debate as a game, it's a competition, right? So these things make sense. But I feel like for new kids especially, they're like, wait, I thought this activity was about like, public speaking, right? Like slow and communicative and like logical reasoning, what makes the most like, common sense and things like that. So I think that's a little, like, it's a hard pill for newcomers to swallow, because that's not, especially with parents. I feel like when most new parents have kids who join debate, they're thinking like, oh, you get on a podium, you make this really slow and understandable speech, and like everyone can understand, can get it. And then sometimes they'll see like a varsity circuit round and they'll be like, I have no idea what's happening.
So if a parent were to come to you and say, look, I want, my elementary student to start learning debate, and, I've seen what your best students do and it makes no sense, and I don't want my kid to be doing this, what would your response to them be?
Yeah, so the way that we kind of funnel kids through our program, I guess like the best analogy is like thinking of karate, right? Like you have like these different levels of belts, like white belt from black belt. So we have like kind of a similar system on our team. So like we would never teach elementary school students like national circuit debate. That would be insanity.
Okay. Yeah.
And I know the NSDA really challenges middle schoolers by giving them the exact high school topic, right? But on our team, our elementary schoolers get a different topic, because I think it's just too far a gap to be like, yeah, debate NATO and the Baltic states for like these fourth and fifth graders. And some of our middle school teams, the novice teams, also debate a different topic. It just to like, we're really big on foundation, like getting them to learn the fundamental foundational skills first before we kick it up a notch. And a lot of the new students will do intramurals within Potomac. So like they actually can't do national circuit until they do a few intramurals and get comfortable and kind of have a firm grasp of what tournaments look like. I think naturally progressing through that, like through these different levels, they kind of get more and more competitive, right? Like not everyone is the best fit for national circuit, and that's okay. I think some people are better off doing traditional debate, and they have a lot of like, they gain a lot of skills and benefits from that too. But I also think that like once you get a little bit more experience under your belt, you kind of realize like, okay, like I like this style versus like I kind of like the faster, more strategic game kind of style. But our goal is to kind of like help the kids find their best fit, right? Whether that's national circuit, traditional, or purely maybe sometimes it's just public speaking. Like we do have a completely separate program that's not as debate driven. Like for example, I know research is not everyone's favorite thing to do in the world, right?
True. Yeah.
And some kids like just really thrive like of being a presenter and a speaker, and so we want to make sure that everyone can learn something from whatever it is that they're doing, but they're also like happy where they're at. Like they love the activity that they're doing, whatever the activity may be.
That makes a lot of sense. Just finding the niche for every kid, not driving everyone to spread.
Yeah.
So relatedly, you are an education expert and obviously a leader of a world-class debate institute. As you, what advice might you give to debate coaches, right? Or maybe how do you think a lot of debate coaches sort of fail their students or could improve with working with their students?
Yeah, I think it's kind of related to what I said earlier about like finding the fit, like the perfect fit for the child. So first within the activity, I know, for example, our academy primarily focuses on PF, but there's obviously like a lot of other styles, right? Like there's British parliamentary, Lincoln Douglas, policy. And again, I think PF has a lot of merits, and I think there's a lot of great, advantages that PF has that maybe the other formats don't. It's my favorite format, but I also don't think it's like the perfect format, right? Or like the perfect fit for every single kid. So I think the first thing is like figuring out kind of like what makes most sense for your child, right? Whether you're a student or a parent or a coach, like thinking about what makes most sense in this particular situation. And kind of, I think, applying that to, let's say you do decide PF is my thing, right? applying that to the actual activity, I think it's about kind of like what argument and what style makes most sense to the child, right? I think sometimes there's like this gut instinct, like coaches saying like, this is the best argument, like this is what we're
Yeah.
gonna go with, which personally I don't like. I've never been like that. I don't think it makes sense because what argument is most convincing to me may not even work on your judge, right?
True. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I also think that like I feel like debates and activity inherent in that's like the advocacy skills you gain, right? And I think even for me, like it's really hard for me to advocate for something that I don't necessarily believe in, or like I feel like there's a better argument that I could make, right? So I think obviously coaches should be there to guide their students, to provide advice and mentorship, but it's to guide, not to do for them, right? Like, so on our team, like I think one thing that's really unique about our team is that we don't really have like a team case. Like our kids run completely different things at tournaments. I think, strategically that's smart, right? Because if an opponent hits one of our teams, it doesn't really matter. If they hit another team later, they're running completely different things. But I think on an individual level, it really helps students to kind of flourish and like find their own advocacy, which not just makes them a better debater, but makes them like a better advocate for other things as well.
Yeah, true. It's an issue I've had, I think, especially with elementary students, which I mean, having elementary students debate is always going to be kind of tough, right? But it's like, if for the most part, I'll just ban any use of evidence or reading for a really long time, right? Just because things have to come from you in order to make sense. It's sort of like, I think if once again advocating maybe for someone else's argument, it is kind of like your vibes are off a little bit, like I'm reading something in French, but I don't really know the French language, right? I'm just kind of saying the words, but my heart's not there.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you.
Let's talk about your role as an admissions mentor and how it relates to debate. Do you have any advice for how existing debaters, and I guess especially middle school or early high school debaters who are not already applying to colleges, how they can augment their debate experience to their advantage when applying to schools, or just how debate may relate to college admissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that question a lot from kids and even more from their parents. I think it's a question that like every parent has on their minds. I think I always say that there's like one of two ways, right? There's direct impact and indirect. And, for the former, it really depends on like, your achievements in debate, right? So like, I hate to be like, well, wins and losses and rankings matter, but just like any type of competitive activity, whether it's a sport or music, like they do matter. These metrics, whether we like it or not, kind of showcases how good you are, right? So I think like students who, are really competitive in the national circuit, like, qualify or go into deep elimination rounds, especially for tournaments like TOC and such, that's going to look great on college admissions, right? Like that's like a highlight in their resume, shows a lot of great, skill sets. But I also think that even if you're not there, and to be fair, that's not every kid's goal, right? Some of them are in debate just to be better speakers and be better researchers and things like that. I think one of the things I really love about debate is that there's really no risk, right? Like I feel like, for example, when you do a sport, you either get recruited because you're a D1 athlete or you don't. And if you don't, it doesn't really help with college admissions much at all, right? Maybe a little bit of leadership and teamwork, but like you can get those skills from other activities. So like I feel like sports is like really kind of high risk, high reward. Whereas with debate, I feel like, maybe you don't get to that level, but just by undergoing the journey and experience, you get all these wonderful skill sets that, indirectly help you with admissions. Right, like every study has talked about that. Studies like admissions and debate has talked about how debaters on average have higher grades, higher test scores, right? And I think just because you read a lot, you write a lot, you do a lot of critical thinking in debate, and I've also I do a lot of mock interviews for college admissions, and I think debaters kind of kill interviews, right? Like they just have this natural presence. They're really good talkers.
Yeah.
So they have this like ability to interview really well without trying almost. And I also think that just like the way that they present themselves, whether they're going like a campus visit or speaking, at like a small group setting in admissions, like, when I work with my debaters for college admissions, I don't really worry about like those aspects. I feel like they kind of already have that from all the years of practicing, speech and such. And that could be a really stressful component of college admissions.
That's enlightening. Yeah. So the interviews, but I guess also, yeah, the admissions essays and maybe just the way that you think about sort of everything coming together. Yeah, that indirect component is really interesting. I know there's a lot of, so in the private debate industry, obviously there's a lot of marketing, right? And a lot of that marketing talks about the benefit of doing debate for college admissions specifically, right? And
Mhm.
so last year I emailed a bunch of college admissions officers. I'm like, hey, is this true? And they're like, I mean, I guess especially for the top schools, um, you know, it's better to be really, really good at something, right? Right. Whether that's rodeo or chess or whatever, right? Instead
Yeah.
of just kind of dabbling in different things. Um, you are the mother of three kids, is that correct?
So I have one kid and two dogs. I call them my
Oh,
kids.
okay.
It's confusing.
Oh, I see, I see, I
Yeah,
see.
yeah. So one real human child, although I am pregnant with my second, so about to
Okay.
be two children and two dogs, but I call them my fur kids, so we can count them as kids too.
Well, I don't know if this question will apply to your fur kids, but let's see, right? So this is, and obviously, you think of you have a kid, and of course, thinking about being a mother, right? And I I imagine there's just that kind of overwhelms your brain at some point, just the
Yes, every
responsibility
day,
of being a parent, like.
every day,
So
every
this is a really large and a perhaps deep question. I don't know, but how has your very intense study of education informed your parenting, if at all?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think that there are things that I consider now that I'm much more sensitive to as a parent that like I probably wasn't like I always knew these issues existed, but I didn't have that like at a gut personal level.
Mm,
So for example, like the debate community and also particularly the school district that we're in, it's a really high pressure competitive community, right?
mm,
I would probably go on a limb and say that most of the kids who compete on the national circuit probably come from very competitive backgrounds, right? What I mean by competitive is that like I feel like Montgomery County, right? Like I feel there's a kind of pressure to achieve, pressure to get into Ivy League schools, like whether that's parental pressure, peer pressure, teacher school, like there's just a lot of pressure to perform. And obviously we know that like that could lead to a lot of negative consequences, right? Like, depression, anxiety, especially with COVID, like isolation, mental health. And I mean, I grew up in this county, so like I'm well aware of these pressures. But I think as a parent, it gives me a completely different perspective. Like I'm worried in a way that I was never worried about before. Like I've always worried about kids, but this is
mm.
just like a kind of different level. Um, I think being a parent has made me kind of like reprioritize and rethink like what are the most important goals for a child, right? And at least personally, as a parent, my philosophy is like I think the most important thing at the end of the day is that my child is happy, healthy, and can lead like a normal life, like can socialize and interact, it isn't like fearful of things, right? And I think these are things that like we need to kind of focus on even before we talk about academics or extracurriculars. And I think every parent's like that, but it's very difficult to kind of prioritize those things in a setting, in an environment where there's so much demand from your children, right, to perform at a certain level.
Yeah, that makes sense. You sound like a really good mom.
I try to be.
So I interviewed your student Karina, and what I think most impressed by was not, I mean, her achievement, obviously the win at SDA is really amazing, or just her interviews. She was really a pleasure to talk with, and also her resume. It's like, debate is like one of many things she excels like really hardcore at. But not all that, just she was so chill. She's just like a nice, like normal, chill person, despite being just a badass in all of these fields. Do you find that with a lot of high achieving debaters or a lot of high achieving students that they also tend to have some kind of like grace that they carry into it, or is there a lot of kind of anxiety and depression that goes along with this high pressure and high achievement environment?
I think it's something that kind of almost takes, I don't know if skill is the right word, but like experience definitely. It takes experience to obtain. So for example, I feel like the biggest distinction I see between like a JV student and varsity student debate isn't so much like their potential, their skill, but just how they go about an obstacle, like how they go about difficulty in their life. So like, for example, like, if you're in varsity, you've been around the block for a while, like, how to handle losses, however difficult they are, right? Especially if you've been in varsity for a number of years. Whereas I actually feel like, I mean, this is a very general kind of statement, so I don't mean like
Right,
every
right.
single student, but I feel like the students who take like losses the hardest, or like, just obstacles in debate the most personal, are JV students. Because I feel like there's a kind of a unique pressure on them, right? Like they're really trying to prove themselves and get to the next level. And I actually think that's the hardest position to be in. Whereas I feel like a lot of the older students who've had a lot of success and achievements, like, at the end of the day, they know that like one loss doesn't define them, one tournament doesn't define them. And I think that's a much healthier outlook. Like, doesn't matter how well or how poorly you do at a particular tournament, right? It's more about the experience, the skills you gain, and just at the end of the day, being happy and passionate about what it is that you're doing. And I think that analogy could be made throughout like high school, right? Like, just hopefully by senior year, you kind of understand, like, whatever horrible thing can happen to you on one day in high school is just one day, right? And
Mm.
like, in hindsight, no one's going to care, no one's going to remember. But of course, when you're in high school, that is extremely difficult to keep in mind.
Yeah, it is hard to have the perspective, you're right, until you have really some experience. Elisa, it's been really great talking. Thank you so much. Where can people find you online?
So my email is elisa@potomactutoring.com. You could also email our general kind of like office manager email. I think all of our contact information should be on our website.
All right, sounds good. Hey, once again, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Sure thing. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.